this week I'm going to be getting into, and I'm going to be talking about, of course, mostly the history of like the Israelites, like really early Jewish history. I'll kind of go into today, which I'll kind of talk about the first few thousand years of Jewish history up to the time of the Romans, of course. And I don't know if you see behind me, I'm sitting, of course, in front of the image of the Western Wall, of course, in Jerusalem. That's, of course, the remnants of what was the Temple of Jerusalem before it was, of course, destroyed by the Romans. You know about that around the first century CE or AD. So I'll talk about that later, about the history of that, because there's a lot of these so-called Jewish-Roman wars where the Jews and the Romans got in a lot of bloody conflicts, and of course it led to a lot of deaths on both sides. Hey, what's up going on, Jeremiah? Also as well. Good morning, also out there. So that's the main topic today. Of course, I'll go discuss about history of course the early Jewish history. So if you have any comments, of course, about this lecture, do let me know, of course, during the live stream, or of course also later on my channel. Also, students, you can also leave comments, of course, in Canvas discussions. Don't forget about that online as well. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and first talk about like the origins of the Israelites, like the early, what we call the Jewish people, of course, later. And if you know much about Judaism, like the religion of Judaism today, I'm actually Jewish myself, if you wonder about that. Of course, the Jewish faith goes back thousands of years. Like I think we go back 4,000 or 5,000 years in history. And if you know about the Jews, they were famous, Israelites, they were famous for monotheism, like the idea of like, the belief in one God, which, before that, most religions, believed in multiple deities. Like polytheism was pretty much the main thing. And so they think that the Israelites were believed to be descended from Canaanite peoples that lived, where ancient modern Israel is today. I think also where Jordan is and maybe part of Lebanon. They think they're kind of like the Israelites were kind of similar to like the Phoenicians, like a long time ago. So they're kind of been compared to, both those. And if you know much about these peoples, they influenced the rise of, different types of monotheistic religions, so-called Abrahamic religions, of course, you see, which are, Judaism, Christianity, and of course, later Islam as well. And so a lot of Jews today think they're descendants from, going back to the time of Abraham, especially through Isaac. I think is of course, the key thing there. There's other names too, like this, Israelites, the old name. That's the Greek name that the Greeks, called them, a long time ago, from the land of Israel. And then, of course, Hebrews, of course, being used from the Hebrew language, of course, that would develop that they spoke in Semitic language. They think that evolved from like Phoenician a long time ago. And the term Jew or Jewish is more of a term because of the tribe of Judah or the kingdom of Judah that actually was there, where ancient Israel is a long time ago, which is the old Latin name. So here's kind of an image of an area you can see on the left there in that map of kind of where Canaan was a long time ago. So obviously, it's a land was situated between the Mediterranean Sea to the west, and then to the east, you've got the area where Jordan is, all that, and then Syria, Lebanon to the north, Arabian Peninsula down below it, Egypt more toward the west. You can see on the right where all the different 12 tribes of Israel, of course, will live, of course, in ancient Israel a long time ago. Now, if you know about it, the Old Testament, that's the main source, of course, on, the early history of the Israelites, early Jewish history, which Jews don't call it the Old Testament. They call it the Tanakh. That's the Hebrew name they use, or people say also the Hebrew Bible as well. And if you know about the name Tanakh, it's an acrostic of the three main sections of the Old Testament, which Torah, it's like the T, Tanakh, of course, which includes like Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Then you got Nevi'im, the so-called prophets. Of course, that next section were the different prophets, of course, that are famous in the Old Testament. And then you got Ketuvim, or Ketubim, pronounced either way, of course, the writings also as well. So you get Tanakh from that name, of course. And then when Christians came along and developed the New Testament, they decided to call the Tanakh the Old Testament. So hence the name being used, of course, later. Of course, the most famous part of the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, is the Torah, the law, which the so-called 5 books of Moses, as they call it, because it was believed a long time ago that Moses had written down traditionally most of the 5 books that were there, or part of that. The Greeks later call it the Pentateuch, which means in Greek 5 books, and so hence that name is sometimes used also as well. Of course, here's Hebrew. That's the traditional language that was used a long time ago by the ancient Israelites, later Jews, and so of course still used today. Modern state of Israel, it's pretty much their main state language that they use, and a lot of synagogues today. A lot of of course, when they have like the Sabbath or whatever kind of holy days or whatever, Hebrews, of course, used quite often, of course, too. But I think a lot of in America, you kind of go between English and Hebrew and that kind of thing. But Hebrew, they think, evolved from other Semitic languages. I think the theory is that Hebrew evolved from probably Aramaic, and before that you had, of course, the Phoenician language, which is probably the one that kind of developed those other ones, of course, later that I talked about before. Of course, the Israelites, Jews later, of course, have a main god, of course, that they worship, which is the god Yahweh, which, of course, the Latin name they use later is Jehovah. Everybody knows, which that name was not really used until really the Middle Ages. I think more the Catholic Church kind of developed that. But Yahweh, they think, may have been one of several gods that the ancient Israelites worshipped, but over time they went to just one God, monotheism, and sometimes you see the God, God in the image of a burning bush, like you read the story about the Book of Exodus, that kind of thing, in a lot of images, but mostly they don't know what God really looks like. Really, I guess a long time ago. And of course, I don't know if you ever know much about why the term Jehovah came about, but they took, the Hebrew name for God, which is on the left, Yahweh, you see there, which, by the way, Yahweh and also the other name, Adonai, both mean this kind of like the same thing, like Lord or Master, if you want. Jews today use the term Adonai, of course, and they took the word Yahweh, which the consonants, they took the vowels in Adonai and they merged it together, and it became Jehovah. This became the name. And then, of course, as you know, later I guess by the Middle Age, they start saying Jehovah, basically, because they don't really pronounce it with a J back then. But that's basically the origin of how the name came about, Jehovah. Now, I'll get into kind of like some background on like the early patriarchs, the early fathers of like Judaism that really start, the early religion back in ancient times, which is over 3,000 years ago. And those are some of the main patriarchs, of course, that are famous in the Bible. Of course, the 3 that are the most famous, are Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Of course, you see there, I think you can see an image kind of blowing it up here. Of course, of Abraham on the left. So Abraham, they think, is the one that started the ancient early Judaism, like a long time ago, like over 3,000 years ago. And they think that Abraham originated from what would be now Mesopotamia. I think they believe that he came from the city of Ur, if I remember correctly, in southern Iraq today, and then migrated to Canaan, where he was promised land there. And by God, and he had his main wife, Sarah, who, of course, would later give him one main son, of course, which was Isaac. However, if you know about it, Abraham had this handmaiden named Hagar as well. And actually, she gave birth to Ishmael before Isaac was born. But I think Jews, kind of later Christians too, I think, don't see Ishmael as being legitimate or whatever. But both those, that's where you get, of course, the origins of, the Jews and the Arabs. So they think that the Jews are, related back through Isaac, to Abraham, and Ishmael, the Arabs, are descended from, of course, that side as well. So they're kind of like Jews or Arabs are kind of like almost like half brothers in a sense with that. And so that's part of why Abraham is sometimes called the father of many nations. I mean, I've heard that term being used. Also, Abraham or Ibrahim, I think there's different variations of how you spell or say his name, of course. Also, Isaac had a wife, Rebekah. They had two sons. You may have heard Esau, but Jacob, of course, was the more important one of the two sons, because Jacob's the one that would have the 12 sons. That would be, part of the so-called 12 tribes of Israel that would later help to settle the land of Canaan, which will be later. You can see all the different women that were associated with Jacob. Jacob had two main wives, Leah and Rachel, of course. Then he had two handmaidens. You probably have heard it before, Zilpah and Bilhah also as well. So that's how they're all related, the so-called 12 tribes, which I guess the one that's the most famous of the 12 tribes, I think Benjamin's pretty famous as well. Also Judah as well, because that's where the kings like David and Solomon, of course, descend from, of course, later. So there you go. Abraham, father of the Hebrews, believe God told Abraham to go to Canaan. You see there. Jacob's the grandson of Abraham. They also called him Israel. That's, of course, another name you'll also see. Israel, of course, the Hebrew variation of it. But it's believed that the patriarchs lived in Israel for a short time before they migrated to Egypt, which in the Bible they mention about how famines may have forced the Israelites, Hebrews, to eventually move there, where the land was more great for farming and obviously for raising livestock, etc. Let me also get into the story of Joseph, which is very famous. That's also like basically in the book of Genesis, you get all these patriarchs, of course, that they talk about. But one of the most famous is the story of Joseph, who, if you know about him, he was a favorite son of Jacob. Remember, I told you Jacob had 12 sons. Also had one daughter he also had as well. But Joseph, you see there, if you know much about it, his 10 brothers, the ones that were with the first wife, which was Leah, they were jealous of him because Jacob, that was his favorite son. Also, Jacob had given Joseph this fancy coat, which they call it different names, but it's usually called the coat of many colors, which kind of a debate about what the coat looked like. Maybe that's kind of what it could have looked like or something like that. Now, I think another theory is that the brothers were also jealous because Joseph could have this knack for interpreting dreams, and so they basically took Joseph and they sold him into slavery when this caravan came through Egypt. And so he ended up in Egypt. And there's a story where, if you know about Joseph, he ended up in prison. And the Pharaoh, which they don't know what Pharaoh was in Egypt at the time, but the Pharaoh was having these horrible nightmares where he kept seeing things like, I think he saw like cows that were like real fat and then cows that were real lean. And then he also saw crops where they were, I think it said sometimes corn. I don't know if they had corn back then, but saw corn where they had no kernels on it and some with a lot of kernels. And so he told the Pharaoh that what they ought to do is build like grain silos or something like that, and that would be able to, allow Egypt to survive when they had bad times, like famines, etc. And so Joseph, under this Pharaoh, became real powerful. He became kind of like a vizier, I think, like kind of like a minister or governor under the Pharaoh. And there's a story later in Genesis where the brothers, flee uh, Canaan, and they, come to Egypt, and they're all kind of reunited together, including Jacob. I think Jacob's the only like patriarch that actually like dies later, in what is like Egypt. So that's the story of Joseph. I think the story of Joseph is kind of a way to connect maybe the earlier patriarchs with, the time of Moses, which of course comes later and all that. So that's the other story, of course, that's real famous, which is the book of Exodus, the second book, of course, in the Old Testament that you have, and of course that's the story, of Moses. Moses, the famous prophet, a Hebrew prophet, of course, who a lot of people connect to now the Ten Commandments. Jews later called Moses sometimes the great lawgiver, because he's the one that not just gave, I guess, everybody the Ten Commandments, but Mosaic laws, that are based in the Old Testament and all that. And he's involved in freeing the, Israelites, in the Exodus story who were in bondage. Because it's believed that sometime after Joseph, that what happened was that the Pharaoh of Egypt basically forced the Israelites into, slavery, which this may have gone on for a few hundred years. Here, of course, it's Moses. They think that Moses came from the tribe of Levi. And there's a story where when he was born, if you know about it, there was a deal where the Pharaoh was going around killing off Israelite children because he thought there were too many of them. And so his mother, Jochebed, took him and put him in a basket and floated him on the Nile, where he was found by one of the Pharaoh's daughter. Now, which Pharaoh it was, they don't know. There's been all kinds of speculation that Ramses the Great was the Pharaoh. Well, they don't really know for sure. But Moses grew to manhood as they think a prince in the actual house of the Pharaoh, like the Prince of Egypt, if you want to call it that way, like the movies and all that they make before or later. But Moses would later find out that he is a Hebrew, that kind of thing. And of course, is later told by God to, go and free, of course, his people. So I'll kind of go into detail about, the story of Moses. But the story about Moses, he fled Egypt at one point because he had killed an Egyptian. And they think he at one point fled eastward and found Mount Sinai. And it's, of course, supposedly on Mount Sinai where God told Moses to return to Egypt and basically free his people, and involve him and his brother Aaron, if you know that, in a lot of stories, of course, with the Exodus. So yeah, Moses would beat the Pharaoh. Like I said, they don't really know who the Pharaoh was, of course, in the Exodus story. It's kind of debate about what century too. But I think today the popular period could be like the 14th or 13th century, seem to be the popular centuries of maybe when he lived. I know Greek sources talk about a pharaoh named Amenephis, maybe being the pharaoh, possibly, which could be one of those Amenhotep pharaohs, which there were four of them, if you know about that, in the New Kingdom. So it could have been one of those, but they don't really know which one it was. They do know that what part of what led the pharaoh to relent and, of course, allow the Israelites to leave were the so-called 10 plagues. They were put on Egypt at the time, which appear in the Exodus. So you see waters turn to blood, frogs, amphibious frogs, of course, everywhere, gnats, flies, disease on the livestock, which I think maybe like boils or whatever, unhealable boils on the skin of like people and things like that, hail and fire, locust, of course, total darkness. And then, of course, most famous one, the 10th and last plague, of course, was the death of the firstborn male, especially. So those are all the things that eventually forced the Pharaoh to eventually let of course Moses lead the Israelites, of course, from Egypt afterwards because of that. So yeah, that's going to lead to that. So all of a sudden, they of course are allowed to leave Egypt like the next day. They think is what it was. And if you know the story about this, when the angel of death was passing over, we go back to the 10th plague. Angel of death supposedly passed over Egypt, and Moses was told to put lamb's blood on the door of their houses, and so it spared their firstborn, I guess, males from dying, and it killed all the Egyptian ones, including supposedly the Egyptians. The Pharaoh's son was also killed as well. So that's kind of where the term Passover came from. If you know about Passover, Passover is, of course, a famous Jewish holiday that happens in the spring. It commemorates, the whole Exodus story of the Israelites in ancient times. And basically, because they had to leave real quick, they didn't have time to make what they call leavened bread, like regular bread that you usually eat. And so they made unleavened bread, which is more like a cracker, which the Jews call matzah. And of course, you eat matzah, on Passover, your Passover Seder, and the worst meal you'll ever have. But it's more of a ritualistic meal that represents, the Exodus story. It also commemorates the spring, when the harvest, like the grain crops are harvested and things like that also as well. Pesach, of course, is the Hebrew name also for Passover. I know Easter for a long time, the Christian faiths, of course, they called it that too, also as well. Supposedly what happened next was that then Moses, after crossing the Red Sea, brought the people the Israelites to what is Mount Sinai. Where is Mount Sinai? Its location, they believe, at least the one location they think it is in the southern part of the Sinai Desert or Peninsula, which is in the eastern part of Egypt, would be where it is today. And Mount Sinai is a mountain that's about 7,500 feet tall. It's located right in front of this monastery that was built under the Byzantine Empire, which is called the Monastery of St. Catherine. So it's right there. And you can actually walk up it because I think the monks there later actually carved steps into it where you go up to the top of it. And so supposedly at the top of that was where Moses wrote down like the 10 Commandments and early Mosaic law and things like that. And so I think I've got an image showing that, of course, right here of the 10 Commandments, which would be there. So that shows up in, of course, Exodus 22 to 17. Like, I am the Lord your God, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve, etc. So you got all these other ones, of course, that are famous. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Remember to keep holy the Sabbath day. Honor your father and mother. You shall not kill. That's a famous one there. 6, you shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife. You shall not covet your neighbor's goods and things like that. So those are all, of course, images there of the famous 10 Commandments that were written down. Some Jews also think that that's when Moses began to write down like the early Mosaic law, like some of the books of the Torah. I think some Jews even think the Talmud, like the early Talmud, you know what that is, like the oral Torah, as they'll be later, was kind of starting to be written down also around that time as well. Now, they do think what happened was supposedly Moses was told to take basically the 10 Commandments and put it in this ark, the so-called Ark of the Covenant, which you see on the right, which was this chest that had like these golden cherubs on it, which are like baby angels. And that's kind of an image of what they think it looked like, basically. And I think the dimensions of it are kind of mentioned in the Bible as well. And there's kind of debate about what went in it. Of course, some people think not just the Ten Commandments, but also Aaron's rod was also put in it. There's even think like manna, if you know what manna is, was put in there. I don't know about that. But the ark was later put into the Temple of Jerusalem, which they think at one point it was put into a room that was called the Tabernacle, or another name they called it was the Holy of Holies. Also as well, which they think is somewhere behind me where the Western Wall is back there, the Wailing Wall. So kind of an interesting chest or cabinet, whatever it was. They don't know what happened to it. Of course, it disappeared, in history. And so still, of course, they're looking for it. And I don't think Indiana Jones found it. This is, of course, a movie, that kind of thing. So there's kind of images of it. In the Bible, it's kind of almost like a weapon, like a secret weapon they're kind of using against enemies, where I think the Philistines and others would take it and bad things would happen. And I think there's a case where they would cross a river and it would part. And some of the stuff you got to wonder if that's really true or not. But those are kind of fantastical stories, of course, that are mentioned in the Bible. Yeah, there's an image of the tabernacle, which you see there, which will later be put into the Temple of Solomon. I think there's a debate about where it was built later in the temple. They think maybe close to where the Dome of the Rock is, has been debated, possibly where it was. But originally it was a mobile tent, is what it really was. That they would keep basically the ark, and they say that's where the presence of God was in it as well. Now, Moses, by the way, would not reach Canaan, like the so-called Promised Land. There's this general and assistant that's under him named Joshua. You may have heard of from the book of Joshua. And he was this Jewish Israelite military commander that basically took over after Moses died. And he's the one that would bring the Israelites back to Canaan. You see images of him right there in the middle. Joshua supposed was a great military commander. He was involved in retaking cities in Canaan, which the most famous he took was Jericho, the Battle of Jericho, which is kind of a debate about what century that was fought in. But they would re-seize that, and then you can see on the right how the 12 tribes would start kind of settling that whole area into different parts, because different tribes were in different locations, you can see. But Benjamin and Judah are the most famous, of course, which are more on the bottom, southern Israel, close to Jerusalem. Of course, what would happen eventually is that they would divide up, that whole land of Canaan into an actual kingdom, which eventually they'll have like two different periods that you'll have. You'll have a united kingdom of Israel that'll first be founded, which they think was founded sometime in the 11th century BC. And then later they have a deal where it divides. If you know about early Jewish history, it divides in these two states, which is you got a northern kingdom. They usually called it Israel. And then the second kingdom was called Judah. Hence the word Jew, Jewish, of course, from that later right there. And going back to the United Kingdom, which only existed for a short time between the 11th and the 10th centuries BC, there was only three major kings that they had: Saul, David, and Solomon. There's a few others, but they were not as important, I guess, compared to those three, which were right there. And Saul came from the tribe of Benjamin, and then David and Solomon came from the tribe of Judah. Those are the origins of both where they came from overall. By the way, that image you see at the top right, the Merneptah stele, that was actually the first archaeological artifact they found, I want to say back in the 19th century, where it mentioned the word Israel being used, which was being used by the Egyptians, and it dates back to the 13th century BC. So the name Israel may date back to that far back in time. Merneptah was some kind of pharaoh that lived close to the time of Ramses the Great. I want to say maybe right before Ramses. He was a pharaoh. Let's see. Also, yeah, here's kind of an idea of the two different kingdoms they have. So the one of Saul, David, you see mostly on the left right there, is the main kingdom they'll have originally, which you can see the kingdom was actually based mostly where modern Israel is today, Jordan, Palestine, and then of course you've also got part of Lebanon. So they think at one point was where Phoenicia was also considered part of where it was. And then over time, you see it was split into two states around the 10th century BC, Kingdom of Israel more in the north, and then Kingdom of Judah more in the south. So these are some of the different kings that they had. Of course, King Saul, of course, was one of the first that would rule mostly around the late 11th century BC is when he was around as king. Not as famous as King David or King Solomon. Saul was very famous, though, for uniting all the tribes. So he basically took all the 12 tribes of the Israelites and merged them into a united kingdom. And so that's the so-called Kingdom of Israel that was founded at one point. And at the same time, when the Israelites were trying to create their state, there were rival peoples that were actually there. The Philistines were the most famous, if you know about it, were there at the same time. These were believed to be also peoples that lived in ancient Canaan. And both those kind of fought for control of that ancient land. Saul was not successful with that. If you know about him, he actually died in battle on the Battle of Mount Gilboa, they think, which happened, I think was a battle, I think close to about 1000 BC. And he and his sons were all killed, basically in the battle. I think Saul committed suicide rather than being captured. Then David came next. He was the second major king. They think there may have been a king after Saul that briefly reigned, who I think his name was Ishbaal, but he was assassinated, and so David came in. David, by the way, was the son-in-law of King Saul. So he would take over afterwards. And David, by the way, was famous as a military commander under the Israelites. If you know about David, he's very famous for the story of David and Goliath. You probably read in the Bible. He was also very successful in defeating the Philistines in war as well. And the big events that happened under King David's reign that he was kind of known for, he founded the capital of Jerusalem. That became the capital, of course, of the kingdom, the United Kingdom of Israel. Later, the Kingdom of Judah also. Yeah, he was militarily successful against the Philistines. And so under him, the kingdom expanded like in size, like from Lebanon into southern Israel would be mostly where it was, and part of Jordan. He is kind of famous for his marriage to Bathsheba. You may have heard about that story, Bathsheba. Bathsheba was this woman that was married to another man, had a husband, and he fell in love with her. And so he had her husband killed. I think his name was Uriah the Hittite. So he could marry her, basically. He's also known for one of his sons, Absalom, rebelled against him. And so he had to kill off one of his own sons, who actually declared himself king of Israel at one point. And so he's kind of famous for different stories like that. They think he was a writer. He wrote some of the book of Psalms also as well. And then, of course, today, if you know about King David, it's often been connected to the Star of David, which you see, or Shield of David, as they sometimes say, or Magen David, of course, in Hebrew, as well. Then you got King Solomon, of course, who was a son of David and Bathsheba, of course, the last major king, really, of the United Kingdom of Israel. Solomon was known for his great wisdom. If you know about him, he supposedly wrote some of the Proverbs in the Bible. especially the Song of Solomon or Song of Songs you may have heard of. It's usually associated with him. But the thing that he was primarily known for, which was very famous, he built, of course, the Temple of Solomon, which they think the Temple of Solomon was constructed sometime close to about 950 BC is when they think it was built. And I think I told you that artisans were used, not just in Israel, but I think Phoenicians were involved helping to construct it. The temple was built on what what they used to call Mount Moriah, which is where the Temple Mount is, of course, in Old Jerusalem. And it was famous for that inner sanctuary that they built inside of it, where the tabernacle was put. And I guess that's kind of what that big room is there at the top, on kind of on the right. That's supposed to be like the tabernacle, where the ark went into. It was often called also the Holy of Holies. So he constructed that. Also, some other things you may have heard about King Solomon. He was supposedly very wealthy, like one of the wealthiest of the different kings of Israel. And he was famous for the so-called King Solomon mines you may have heard about, which they think were somewhere in Africa that he had. And then I think there's a theory that maybe the King Solomon mines were somewhere in the Great Rift Valley, like in the eastern part of Africa. And then there's another story where he was connected with, you may have heard the story about the Queen of Sheba, has also been connected to with King Solomon. The Queen of Sheba was believed to be some kind of ancient queen of either maybe Ethiopia or Yemen, but they're not sure if she's real or not. She's mentioned in the Bible, but there's kind of a debate today about whether she existed. So that's the story of King Solomon. But yeah, Solomon had a weak spot, if you know what it is. He had a lot of wives, like I think a few hundred wives and concubines. And so I guess that's one thing he was kind of corrupted with. And then he was known for also extorting the people with high taxation, which kind of is part of why the kingdom broke up and split. So here's kind of an image of where all the tribes were. Yeah, Solomon would die, they think close to like the 920s, like maybe 922 or right before that. And all the northern tribes, they wanted to break away and form their own state. And so that left two tribes afterwards. You get what you see on the right, you get these two kingdoms that form, which they got the kingdom of Israel in the north, which was based around Samaria, you can see. And then the kingdom of Judah was based around the old capital of Israel, which was Jerusalem. And so Jerusalem becomes the capital, of course, of the kingdom of Judah that you have. So yeah, here's another image of it right here. There's just two different kings that kind of emerge afterwards. On the right, you had what they call Rehoboam. Rehoboam was a son of King Solomon, sometimes called Rehoboam the First. And so he's the one that's the founder of what becomes later the kingdom of Judah that breaks away. And you get just like Benjamin and Judah are the two tribes that basically create the state. And it's created basically where those two tribes lived, which were mostly in that area in the southern part, like around Jerusalem, and more into the bottom of Israel today. And then Jeroboam, later called Jeroboam the First, was some type of powerful minister that was under Solomon. And so he broke away with the 10 tribes in the north, and they created their own separate state, the kingdom of Israel, so they call it later, which I told you was based at Samaria, which I think that's in the West Bank today. So yeah, both those would kind of continue separate. The states never got back together. So Judah and Israel never reunited again as one state. Over time, what happened was they'll eventually be conquered by other more powerful states that are around, Israel, like the Egyptians at one point would come in and they would kind of conquer that area. And they actually would, I think Judah at that time would kind of become like a vassal state to states like Egypt, states like Assyria as well. And it was primarily because I think they talk about sometimes how the Israelites there had like a lot of like commodities, like I think olive oil was kind of important. And so, but the only thing was because of the fact that they were kind of connected more, allied with more with the Egyptians, that led to Nebuchadnezzar in the Chaldean Neo-Babylonian Empire eventually invading, and they would eventually conquer them. That's the thing that happened. You know about this. Nebuchadnezzar, of course, would sack what is basically Judah, which the date on that, when that happened, varies. The Assyrians, we've talked about it before, the Assyrians had absorbed most of the northern tribes, the so-called lost tribes of Israel, get taken over by Assyria. Samaria is eventually conquered by the Assyrians, like under like King Sargon II and other similar kings. But the more famous one, was Nebuchadnezzar II, who they think sacked Judah and Jerusalem sometime, they think, right after 600 BC. There's kind of a debate about what year it was, 597 or 587 BC is the two popular dates of when it occurred. But in the Bible, like the book of Daniel and other similar kinds of books that are like that, Nebuchadnezzar basically sacked the city, destroyed the Temple of Solomon, and forced thousands of remnants of the kingdom of Judah to be forced into captivity. And so you can see they were brought back to Iraq and Mesopotamia, where Babylon is. They were forced to live there for almost half a century. That they live in that part of the world, which was very foreign to them. Like when they got there, they have all these different, foreign gods that they were worshiping, like the god Marduk and other gods that we've talked about before. I think there's kind of a debate about when the Bible was starting to be written down and compiled and all that, but they do think a lot of books of the Bible were starting to be kind of written after that time, and that the Babylonian exile or captivity of the Israelites had a major impact on Jewish history and also, the Old Testament as well. So the sack of Jerusalem, it's kind of debate about what happened to the ark after that. Some people think it was hidden, or maybe they took it away. Some people think that it was hidden, of course, from basically the Babylonians, and they still have it later, but I think it's still debated about who ends up with it, of course, later. They're not sure. It's kind of a mystery. They do know that what eventually happens is that the Babylonian Empire of Nebuchadnezzar, it'll eventually be conquered by the Persians. The Persians will come in from what is Iran. You can see here, you've got the Persian Empire, which was founded by Cyrus the Great, also known as Cyrus the First, who they think founded the Persian Empire in the 6th century BC. His empire, of course, would become one of the most massive ones in history so far, which would include territories on 3 continents. I'll probably talk about Persia later. I haven't really gone into detail about Persia. When I get to the Greeks, I'll get more into a lot of their history. But you can see here the Persian Empire formed in Iran, which was part of like mostly the area where Media, northern Iran was, in Persia, which was in southern Iran. And over time, Cyrus the Great was able to consolidate this into like one large empire, which took over like Turkey, Mesopotamia, eventually where Israel is, and then eventually Egypt also. So it becomes this huge empire, which is in part of like Asia, Africa, and then even we'll get to when I get to the Greeks. The Persians also try to conquer part of Europe where Greece is today. So yeah, they do free them. That's one thing that's very famous about Cyrus the Great. Some Jews even kind of saw Cyrus as like a Messiah. He kind of releases them from bondage. So you have some cases where Jews leave Babylon and they go back to Israel, like Judah, where Jerusalem is. There are some that stayed though, of course, in Babylon. So you get some Jews that are there and there in the east, and of course, in the west. Now, they do come back. If you know about it, like in the 6th century BC, it's believed that they start reconstructing a new temple. So you get this so-called Second Temple that's built right there. That's just kind of a mock-up of maybe what the temple looked like with that famous tabernacle or Holy of Holies that was kind of in the middle of it. Right there. So that's kind of an image of what they think it looked like. And so it was kind of walled, and that's kind of what's, where the Temple Mount was, I guess, or I think only the bottom of it's still there today, and part of the Western Wall is also in existence, or part of it is. I think only part of that wall is actually maybe goes back to that same time period. However, what happened was, if you know about Alexander the Great, eventually invaded the Near East in the 4th century BC. If you know about the Alexander the Great, he would eventually destroy what is the Persian Empire. All that area you're looking at, the Persians had tried to take over, of course, from like Iran, India, all the way to Turkey and Egypt. And so in the late 4th century BC, Alexander conquered that whole area and brought Greek culture eastward, like into the Near East, so-called Hellenistic age. They sometimes dub it. And if you know about that, that was a major influence on Judaism. Like you have Hellenistic Judaism that kind of evolves from that, and you get priests and things like that they have in the temples. And what happened was there was this empire that formed after Alexander died, which was called the Seleucid Empire, which you see there, because Alexander lived a short life. He died at the age of 32. His empire was broken up among his generals, and they had a general named Seleucus I, who founded the Seleucid Empire, which the Seleucid Empire was this Hellenistic state in Persia, part of Iraq and Syria, and it flourished between the 4th centuries and the 1st centuries BC. What's famous about the Seleucids when it comes to Judaism? Well, if you know about the Seleucid Empire, they tried to stamp out Judaism. They tried to get rid of it because the religions that were more important in the Seleucid Empire was predominantly the Greek religion, like the god Zeus was the preferred god they worship, and then another popular god was Zoroaster, Zoroastrianism. Then you had like Judaism, which was kind of a minor religion, which was mostly practiced in parts of where Syria, Israel is, and of course also in Mesopotamia, Iraq. So what happened, there was this incident that occurred, if you know about the 2nd century BC, where these Jewish rebels named the Maccabees in Israel, they were threatened by this Greek ruler who was a Seleucid ruler named Antiochus. I think he's the Antiochus IV. And he tried to stamp out Judaism and force the Jews to worship like Greek gods. And so this man named Judah or Judas Maccabee or Maccabeus, they call him different names. That's the Latin name, I guess, Maccabeus. He led an army, of course, against the Greek forces and eventually defeated them in battle. And so there's a story, if you know about it, where they went to rededicate the temple. Because if you know about the Greeks had gone in and desecrated the temple and tried to put in like Greek gods and things like that. And there was a case where, if you know about in the Holy of Holies or Tabernacle, they would keep this eternal lamp going all the time, like lit, probably with olive oil back then. And apparently they only had enough oil to burn the lamp for one day. But if you know the story, it lasted for 8 days, and it was considered a miracle. And so that became the so-called Jewish festival of Hanukkah, sometimes called the Festival of Lights as well. And so after that, they began to celebrate it, the Maccabees. And so that's now a famous Jewish holiday, of course, today. So yeah, Judah, Jew of the Hammer, of course, they call him sort of like a superhero to some Jews, a long time ago in history. And so, yeah, that's why they have Hanukkah now. Like the holiday of Hanukkah usually happens around December, kind of similar to almost like the time of Christmas, I guess, modern times today. But if it wasn't for Hanukkah, there wouldn't be Christmas. I don't know if you know that or not. But if they would have stamped out Judaism, there would have been no Christianity, that kind of thing. So just think about that, of course, today. One thing about the Maccabees, the Maccabees started a period afterwards, which is called the Hasmonean era, and they had the kingdom that came in afterwards. They founded the Hasmoneans, which the Hasmoneans were these Jewish kings that kind of reigned over Israel between the period of like about the 2nd century BC to about the 1st century BC. There's about 10 of them that reigned. I think there's actually one of them that was actually a female ruler, a queen that reigned. And the man on the right you see there, Simon Thazi, he was considered one of the first that would reign, and he was related back to the Maccabees. So you can see that's kind of the land that they controlled in that area between Israel and Palestine, I guess Jordan. It's about the area that they controlled. And a lot of the kings were kind of like Hellenized. There was like Greek kings, I guess. They kind of reigned, Greek Jewish kings, if you want to call it that way, basically. And over time, what happened was the Romans came in. The Romans, by the 1st century BC, would actually take over Israel, like ancient Israel, what they called Judah back then. And the Romans called it Judea. That was the term they used for that area. And so they have all these kings that would reign that were Jewish, but they were kind of like Jewish client kings, really, of the Romans that would come into power. Herod the Great was the most famous. He was a Roman Jewish client king that reigned from 37 to about 4 BC. And his rule was often called the Herodian kingdom, is what they dubbed it. So I think he was really the only king of that particular state. He's really the most famous ruler of that time. He's, around when they think Jesus is born, in, of course, the Bible, the New Testament. It's about the end of his reign. Well, that will occur. And after he died, the Romans start to kind of take over the land of Israel and kind of control it more directly. But Herod was famous for a lot of things. Like he was known for a lot of his building projects, such as renovating the temple, like the temple the way it is later. Of course, like I guess more of that design we're looking at right there. And that image I keep showing is really kind of what it looks like they think by the time of the 1st century BC, or the time when Jesus lived, of course, later in the 1st century AD or CE. He founded the city of Caesarea, which was a important city that's now in northern Israel today. So they think he founded it sometime at the late part of the 1st century BC. On the left, on the bottom, he built this huge fortress near the Dead Sea, which I'll talk about later. Was called Masada. And Masada was this fortification that was kind of on their eastern border. And it was also used as a palace retreat. He had built like 2 palaces on it, where you sometimes go there and have a retreat there at that site. And then on the right, on the bottom, the Herodium was a city and another fortress that he constructed too in Israel that kind of bears his name now today. So yeah, he's more known for his building projects and stuff like that. Now, later, they have a deal, if you know about it, in the 1st, 2nd centuries where the Jews eventually revolt from Roman rule. That's one thing that occurs. If you know about Jewish nationalism, is something that starts to kind of come about. They think that's where the whole Jewish Messiah comes from. This idea that there's like kind of like a King David or some figure that's kind of similar to David, that'll free them from the Romans and become more independent. And there's one group that they think helped to cause a lot of the miseries of the Jewish Roman wars, as they call it later, is that man on the right you see there, which was Judas of Galilee. He lived about close to, I want to say, maybe a few years before Jesus lived, kind of late first century BC. He may have died early first century CE. And he was a founder of this group called the Zealots. How many of you heard about the Zealots? But the Zealots were a type of Jewish sect in Israel that they think caused the whole Jewish Roman wars to break out. They wanted to kill Romans and create like a separate Roman state. And they had a nickname. They were sometimes called the Sicarii because they would had these like daggers that they would keep under their like robes or whatever. They would pull them out and stab Romans and kill them, or kill people that were sympathetic to Romans and things like that. And so that was kind of a nickname that they were dubbed, the so-called Sicarii. And eventually you have several wars break out, which are famous. They're called the Jewish-Roman Wars, which if you know about the Jewish-Roman Wars, they would result in, by the way, something like 1 to 2 million Jews would be killed in these wars against the Romans. Those pretty bloody affairs. They had the first Jewish-Roman War, 66 to 73 CE. That one's the one that we'll talk about the most. That one was the most famous, which has got all kinds of names. The Jewish War, the Great Revolt, the Great Jewish Revolt, I think is another name. They also nickname it as well. They had a small rebellion in 115 called the Kittos War. I think they dub it. And then there's a third war later you may have heard of called the Bar Kokhba Revolt as well, which was also pretty bloody. But all those later are going to end up causing what they call the Jewish diaspora to occur, where all the Jews are dispersed, throughout the Roman Empire at the time. I did want to talk about this man I've kind of talked about before, which was Flavius Josephus. If you know about him, Josephus was a Roman Jewish general that fought in the first Jewish-Roman War. Later, he became a historian. He wrote a bunch of books about Jewish history, which the most famous one he wrote was The Jewish War, which went into detail about what happened in the war, what caused it, and the aftermath of the war as well. He also wrote a series of books called The Jewish Antiquities, which was a history of the Jewish people, like the history of Jews from biblical times to his time around the first century. And Josephus wrote most of his historical works in the late first century CE, basically. Why is he called Flavius Josephus? His real name is, I think usually it's Joseph ben Matthias. He became friends with this Roman emperor, who I'll show you on the right, which is Vespasian. That's him on the left right there. Vespasian was one of the two main generals that fought in the first Jewish-Roman War. They eventually put it down. And Vespasian later became famous for constructing the Roman Colosseum, which ironically was built with Jewish slaves. If you know about this, probably about 100,000 estimated anyway. And he actually befriended Flavius Josephus, who was actually captured in the war, and gave him his name. I think he even gave him some money and stuff like that. And so a lot of Jews later see Josephus as a traitor, because he kind of switched to the Roman side and all that. And the man on the right, that's Vespasian's son. He'll later be emperor too, 79 to 81. Titus is famous for several things. He's the one that actually sacked Jerusalem in the year 70 and destroyed it. And then if you know about Titus, he was also emperor when Mount Vesuvius erupted, which destroyed like cities like Pompeii. I'll get to that later when I get more into, of course, the history of like the Romans. But yeah, the siege of Jerusalem, that was the most bloody affair really that occurred with the first Jewish-Roman war. The Romans sacked it and destroyed it. And according to Josephus, most of the population was either killed or dispersed. He claims that in the Jewish war, that up to like maybe 1 million Jews may have been killed in the war. They're not sure if that's exaggerated or not, but they do know that some of them were also dispersed afterwards, which a lot of them will be enslaved, afterwards, forced to live like in the Roman Empire and all that. And about it, not much is left of it. Of course, today, like the remnants of what was, I guess the second temple that was there. Part of it is that wall you're looking at, the so-called Western Wall, which Jews today call it the Wailing Wall also. And I think only part of the wall actually dates back to the time of maybe the second temple. They think the rest of the wall was built later by Arabs or the Turks. So you're looking at that. That's considered one of the holiest sites to Jews today, of course, in Israel. So-called Wailing Wall, as they called it. By the way, the Jews, when they were forced into slavery in the Roman Empire, like I told you, they were forced to build the Roman Colosseum. They also built the Arch of Titus, which you see right in front of it, which actually has like stuff carved in it, showing all the loot that they're kind of taking the Romans from Jerusalem. I'll talk about also the siege of Masada. There were some Jews that held out on that fortification of Masada. There was this man named Alazar ben Yair. He was kind of, they think, a descendant of Judas of Galilee, and some of these zealots, they actually retreated to what is that fortification and took it in the war. And so they tried to hold out there against the Romans. I think it happened around 73, 74 CE. And what happened was the Romans brought in an army right there and laid siege to it. And instead of waiting for them, I guess, to starve to death or whatever, what they decided to do, if you know about it, was they brought, you can see the camp where the army was on the right there. They decided to build a siege ramp up to it where they could then basically break into the fortress and take it back. This Herod the Great fortress, difficult at first, I think when they tried to build the ramp, they were throwing rocks down on them and projectiles, but pretty much turns out to be futile at that point. And what ends up happening is they think, according to Josephus, they killed themselves, is what happened. Everybody committed suicide. Or at least the claim is that the men killed all the other men, children, and women. When the Romans broke into it, they were mostly all dead, except for a few women and children, I think, survived, but most of them, of course, died. They do have one more famous event that's kind of, like I said, like one of these Jewish revolts they have that's well known. That's the Bar Kokhba revolt you may have heard about. And they had this man named Simon ben Kosaba, or Kosaba, spelled different ways, or Koba, or Ben Bar Kokhba, they called him as well. And he was this Jewish military leader that a lot of Jews claimed to be the Messiah because they thought he would restore Jewish nationalism to Israel. And so he revolted against the Romans and tried to actually create a Jewish state, which he did for about 3 years. It happened, by the way, the Bar Kokhba revolt happened between 132 to about 136 BC, about 3 or 4 years. And it was put down by this Roman emperor you see here named Emperor Hadrian. And Hadrian's famous like Hadrian's Wall and things like that in the Roman Empire. And the Romans had to bring up massive armies, which I think they estimate their armies may have been somewhere like about 120,000 troops at one point, because Bar Kokhba had something like 300,000 men that he kind of amassed to try to keep this state. And so the Romans eventually crushed it. If you know about that, what happened, even though it was like house to house fighting, I think, in most of like the streets of Jerusalem and other cities. But Cassius Dio, who's a famous Roman historian, he actually said that maybe more than 500,000 may have been killed in that one also as well, to kind of give you an idea of how bloody these events were. And I think the Romans took worse casualties in this conflict compared to the previous one in the first century. They think those numbers might be exaggerated, but they think all these wars combined, it may have been somewhere between 1 to 2 million that may have been killed at one point. And so, yeah, one thing that results from, all these wars between the Jews and the Romans, you get the so-called Jewish diaspora, where what ends up happening is all the Jews are dispersed, throughout the Roman Empire, into Turkey, North Africa, parts of Europe. And you see the word diaspora is a Greek word meaning scattered. And so that's how these Jews end up like in parts of Europe later, like especially in Germany and countries like Poland and parts of Eastern Europe where they'll be. And following the Jewish diaspora, one thing that happens, if you know about it, is they take the name Judea or Israel, and the term that the Romans start calling it is Palestine, which is the name they use a lot today. And it was named after a province of the Roman Empire called Syria Palestina, which was, by the way, named from the Philistines, which lived there a long time ago. But of course, they don't exist anymore. The Philistines were wiped out years ago. But that's where the word Palestine originates from, of course, from the Romans using it, of course, afterwards. So, yeah, the Jews, won't really have an independent state again, of course, until after the Holocaust happens in World War II. And you end up with the state of Israel, of course, the old Jerusalem behind me right there, with, of course, the Western Wall. As well. So that's kind of a history of the Jews. The Jewish history keeps going. You go into like medieval, modern times. There's a lot of extensive Jewish history, which Jewish history is like 4,000 or 5,000 years of history. So a lot of history too. The people and the religion and the culture, things like that are still part of it, of course, today. So that's it. Of course, my lecture on, of course, Israelites, early Jewish history. It's like Sean has got a question. Yeah, of course, about that. So yeah, I do have it's good about that, filling that out. So study guide. I do have this lecture I have posted, of course, online on the Israelites and the Jews. I do have a more extensive study guide if you want to take a look at that as well, because I do have a new quiz I'm posting today, which you see right here. I will have a quiz, of course, on the Phoenicians, Israelites. Do look at the study guide questions I kind of added to both those PowerPoint lectures, which has more extensive questions to help you, for that particular assignment. That assignment will probably be due sometime, I want to say, well, it says February 27th, but probably going to be due early March is when it's going to be, because, we do have Mardi Gras coming up pretty soon. So like next week, we don't have classes on Monday and Tuesday. So just want to remind you about that. So I know next week I'll be moving on to talk about ancient India. That's going to be the next topic, which I guess I'll start on that next Wednesday. But like I said, no classes for Monday and Tuesday coming up. So that's pretty much it today. I think that's pretty much, I don't think I've got any other, looks like I've got another comment from, I know Sean right there. Yeah, of course, thanks about that. But that's pretty much it for today. Y'all have a great weekend, of course. coming up. And by the way, yeah, happy Mardi Gras. Yeah, kind of put that up there for you also as well. So y'all take care. And if you have any questions about any of these lectures, do let me know, of course. Also, don't forget, if you got a comment, of course, about the class, do let me know via email. Don't forget Canvas discussions as well. Of course, you can also leave comments. So y'all take care. I'll see y'all, of course, next week.